What if the very thing that makes you so kind is also what is slowly draining you? Because the moment an empath chooses peace over people, something inside their entire emotional world begins to change. And before you assume this is about becoming distant or cold, stop for a second. Because what you are about to hear is not about losing your empathy. It is about finally learning how to stop losing yourself inside it. If you have ever felt emotionally exhausted after caring too much, stay with this. You may realize that what you called love was often silent self-abandonment. You felt everything they never said out loud, their anxiety before they spoke a word, their disappointment before they were willing to admit it, their loneliness even when they were surrounded by people laughing as if nothing was missing.
You didn't just notice it, you absorbed it, you carried it quietly, automatically, without ever being asked and without ever being properly seen for it. And for a long time, you probably didn't even label it as something unusual. It just felt like who you were. But what you were actually doing was not simply loving people more deeply. It was slowly erasing parts of yourself in order to hold emotional weight that was never meant to sit entirely on your shoulders alone. And here's the question nobody ever asked you in a real, honest way. What happened inside you while you were so busy holding everyone else together? What did you lose while you were making sure everyone else didn't fall apart? Because most people who live like this don't notice the cost in real time. They only feel it later in quiet moments when life slows down just enough for the silence to speak back. And when it does, it's not gentle, it's revealing. It shows you how much of your energy was spent outward and how little was ever left to return inward to yourself. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't look like exhaustion from the outside.
You can sleep and still feel drained. You can rest and still feel emotionally overused. It is the exhaustion of someone whose nervous system never fully switches off in social spaces. The kind of person who walks into a room and immediately starts reading everyone without trying. You notice tone changes, micro-expressions, shifts in energy that others completely miss. And while that awareness makes you deeply perceptive, it also means your mind is constantly working, constantly processing, constantly holding emotional information that most people are completely unaware of. From a neuroscience perspective, this is not imagination or overthinking. Emotional sensitivity is tied to heightened activity in brain regions responsible for empathy, emotional recognition, and social prediction. Your brain is essentially built to simulate what others feel in real time. That means when someone around you is stressed, your system partially reflects it.
When someone is sad, you don't just understand it logically, you experience a version of it internally. This is why emotional environments affect you so deeply. You are not weak for this. You are responsive at a level most people do not consciously operate at. For a long time, this ability probably made you feel valuable. You were the one people leaned on, the one who noticed everything, the one who understood without long explanations. You became emotionally dependable in ways that made you feel needed, but slowly something starts to blur. Being needed begins to feel like being responsible. And being responsible for everyone begins to replace responsibility for yourself. You stop noticing where your emotions end and where others begin. And in that space, you become less of a participant in your own life and more of a container for everyone else's emotional experience. There often comes a moment when this pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It doesn't arrive dramatically.
It comes quietly. You might be sitting alone somewhere ordinary, maybe in a car, maybe in a room after a long day, and you suddenly realize how long it has been since someone genuinely checked in on you without needing anything from you. That realization doesn't shout, it sinks. And in that sinking, you start to see the imbalance clearly for the first time. You were always available for others, but rarely held in the same way in return. When people reach this point, they usually respond in two different ways. Some begin to shut down emotionally. They reduce how much they feel, how much they give, how much they allow themselves to care. It feels like protection, but it slowly becomes disconnection. Others choose a more difficult path. They don't stop being sensitive. They don't stop caring. They simply begin to redefine what their sensitivity is for.
Instead of automatically absorbing everything, they start learning where to place boundaries, where to pause, and where to step back without guilt. That is not emotional coldness. That is emotional clarity forming for the first time. To understand this shift properly, you need to understand what empathy actually is at its core. Empathy is not just emotional understanding. It is a biological process where your nervous system mirrors the emotional state of another person. When someone expresses distress, your body responds in subtle ways as if part of that experience is being reflected inside you. This is what makes human connection so powerful. It is also what makes emotional overload so easy for sensitive individuals, because the system that connects you to others is the same system that can overwhelm you. The important distinction that almost nobody teaches is the difference between feeling with someone and caring someone. Feeling with someone is natural empathy.
Caring them is emotional responsibility that does not belong to you. Somewhere along the way, many deeply sensitive people were taught directly or indirectly that noticing someone's pain meant they had to fix it, that understanding someone's emotion meant they had to manage it. And over time, that belief quietly turns awareness into obligation. When this becomes deeply ingrained, it leads to a psychological pattern known as emotional fusion. This is when your emotional state becomes so tied to the emotional state of others that you lose internal separation. You cannot feel calm if someone else is upset. You cannot feel safe if someone else is uncomfortable. Your inner world becomes dependent on external emotional stability. And because people are always changing emotionally, always reacting, always feeling something different, you end up in a constant state of quiet alertness, never fully settled, never fully at rest, always partially outside yourself.
The research on emotional labor, a concept originally developed within the sociology of human service professions, reveals something that should deeply concern any person who naturally cares for others. Continuous emotional labor, meaning the ongoing effort of managing, suppressing, or even amplifying emotions to meet the emotional expectations of others, is strongly linked with burnout, weakened immune response, reduced mental clarity, higher levels of anxiety, and depressive symptoms. More quietly and perhaps more profoundly, it is associated with a gradual but measurable fading of authentic self-identity over time. You don't only become tired through this process, you slowly become unfamiliar to yourself in a way that is hard to explain but deeply felt once it has already happened. Over years of emotional overextension, something subtle yet serious begins to unfold within a person.
The inner voice that once clearly expressed what you feel, what you need, what you desire, and what you believe slowly becomes less audible. It does not disappear suddenly. Instead, it weakens because you have repeatedly trained yourself to prioritize the emotional states of others over your own internal signals. It is like slowly turning down the volume on your own experience while constantly increasing sensitivity to everyone else's emotional world. This shift is so gradual that most people do not notice it happening until they suddenly realize they can describe others with incredible detail, but struggle to clearly define themselves. If you speak to someone who has spent many years as an emotional caretaker, whether in personal relationships or in professional helping roles, and ask them to describe their own emotional state in the present moment without referencing anyone else, many of them will pause for a long time.
Some will struggle to answer directly. They might talk about what others feel or what they think they should feel or what they used to feel in different circumstances, but accessing their own immediate internal emotional reality becomes surprisingly difficult. This is not a personal failure or weakness. It is the predictable outcome of a long-established psychological pattern where self-awareness has been consistently redirected outward instead of inward over time. This process is not random, and it is not a moral issue. It is behavioral conditioning that develops gradually through repetition. And like all deeply learned patterns, it can be changed, but only once it is fully recognized and understood. Choosing emotional peace over constant emotional absorption does not mean rejecting people or isolating yourself from meaningful relationships. That is one of the biggest misunderstandings sensitive individuals often carry.
The fear is that if you stop carrying other people's emotional burdens, you will lose your ability to connect, care, or love deeply. But this fear, although understandable, does not reflect psychological reality. In fact, research on emotional boundaries in highly empathic individuals shows the opposite outcome. People who learn how to remain emotionally present without taking full responsibility for others' internal states often develop stronger, more stable, and more fulfilling relationships. Their connections do not weaken, they become more balanced. Instead of emotional exhaustion, there is emotional sustainability. Instead of over-involvement, there is clarity. They do not love less, they simply stop loving in a way that leads to self-neglect. Their love becomes more stable because it is no longer driven by anxiety or obligation. The psychological mechanism behind this is straightforward.
When a person is constantly depleted emotionally, their ability to be fully present in relationships is reduced. They may still appear engaged on the surface, they may still say and do the right things, but internally they are running on empty. Their attention is divided, their emotional energy is stretched thin, and their presence loses depth. People around them can often sense this absence, even if nothing is openly said. Real connection requires internal stability, not emotional exhaustion hidden behind effort. Interestingly, the most supportive thing you can offer others is not unlimited emotional absorption, but emotional steadiness. When you are internally grounded, others can actually experience your presence more clearly and more safely. There is something deeply stabilizing about being with someone who is not overwhelmed by everything you feel. It allows space for genuine connection instead of emotional merging. You are no longer trying to fix everything or carry everything.
You are simply present, and that presence becomes more meaningful than constant emotional reaction ever could be. When emotionally sensitive individuals begin shifting toward this healthier balance, the early experience often feels uncomfortable. At first, it can feel like you are doing something wrong. When you stop immediately fixing someone's emotional discomfort, your nervous system may react strongly, as if you are neglecting a responsibility. This reaction is not intuition, it is habit. For a long time, your system has learned that other people's distress requires immediate action from you. So when you do not respond in the old way, it can feel unnatural or even guilty, even when nothing harmful is actually happening. The key distinction here is between conditioning and awareness. Conditioning tells you that your value depends on how quickly you regulate other people's emotions.
Awareness shows you that emotions belong to the person experiencing them and that your role can be supportive without being self-sacrificial. Being present does not require becoming emotionally overwhelmed. Listening does not require absorbing. Caring does not require carrying. These distinctions are essential for emotional maturity, even though they often feel unfamiliar at first. As this shift continues, some relationships may begin to change. People who were unconsciously relying on your emotional overfunctioning may feel uncomfortable when you no longer respond in the same way. They might interpret your new boundaries as distance or emotional withdrawal, But in reality, what is changing is not your capacity to care, but your refusal to lose yourself in the process. Relationships that depend entirely on your emotional depletion are not balanced connections. They are patterns of dependency that were never sustainable in the first place.
Eventually, there comes a quiet internal turning point where something fundamental shifts. You begin to notice that you can stay present with someone's emotional experience without being consumed by it. You can witness their sadness without carrying it into your body. You can hear their fear without internalizing it as your own. You can care deeply without losing your own emotional center. This is not emotional detachment. It is emotional clarity, where empathy and self-presence exist at the same time without conflict. Psychological research often refers to this capacity as emotional differentiation, a core component of healthy relational functioning. It describes the ability to remain connected to others while maintaining a stable sense of self. People who develop this ability tend to experience stronger mental health, greater relationship stability, and a more sustainable form of empathy. It is not about feeling less.
It is about no longer disappearing inside what you feel for others. To be fully in contact with another person's inner world without losing contact with your own is not something that comes naturally to most people. It is not an automatic trait you are simply born with, even though it can feel that way when you have always been sensitive. In reality, it is a skill that develops over time. And like any meaningful skill, it is shaped through repetition, discomfort, mistakes, and the willingness to return to yourself again and again. It is built in small moments where you consciously choose not to abandon your own inner experience just because someone else's emotions feel louder or more urgent in that moment. This is where the real work of emotional peace begins for a deeply sensitive person. It begins with something that feels almost too simple to matter at first, yet changes everything over time. It is the practice of sitting with your own feelings before you reach outward.
Before you pick up your phone to check on someone else, before you scan the room to see who might need emotional support, before you instinctively adjust yourself to match the emotional atmosphere around you. Instead of doing all of that automatically, you pause, even briefly, and ask yourself with honest attention, how am I actually doing right now? Not how is everyone else doing, not what does everyone else need, but what is happening inside me in this moment? This practice slowly teaches you the difference between empathy and responsibility, which is one of the most important distinctions a sensitive person can ever learn. You can feel what another person is feeling without making it your job to carry it. You can understand their emotional state without becoming responsible for fixing it. You can care deeply without turning that care into self-neglect. The feeling itself is not the problem.
The confusion between awareness and obligation is where suffering begins. When you stop believing that every emotional signal you notice requires action from you, you start to regain a sense of internal balance that may have been missing for a long time. Part of this process also requires learning to tolerate being misunderstood. When you stop overfunctioning emotionally in relationships, when you stop instantly absorbing or resolving everything around you, some people will misread your change. They may interpret your calmness as distance. They may assume your boundaries mean disinterest. They may even see your emotional stability as a form of rejection. But what they are actually reacting to is the loss of a version of you that had no limits. Change often looks like withdrawal to those who benefited from your lack of boundaries. That does not make your growth wrong. It simply reveals a shift in dynamics that was always one-sided. This stage also requires something deeper and more uncomfortable, which is grief.
Not dramatic grief, but quiet internal grief for relationships that were not what you believe them to be. Some connections were built around your emotional availability more than mutual emotional care. Some relationships continued because you consistently overextended yourself to maintain them. Realizing this does not mean those moments were fake or meaningless, but it does mean they were not fully balanced. Letting go of the illusion of equality in those relationships is painful because it forces you to see clearly where you were giving more than you were receiving, and where your emotional labor became the foundation holding things together. Grief in this context is not bitterness, it is clarity. It is the emotional process of finally accepting that some bonds existed because you kept them alive through effort, not because they naturally sustained you in return. This realization is often what allows true emotional independence to begin.
Because once you see where you were overinvested, you also begin to understand where you were undersupported. And that awareness becomes the starting point for change, even if it feels unsettling at first. As this shift continues, you begin to encounter a completely different experience of peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from avoiding conflict or escaping emotionally intense situations, but the kind of peace that remains steady even when life around you is not. This is not numbness. It is not emotional shutdown. It is not detachment from life. It is the ability to stay internally grounded while still being open to connection. It is a state where your emotional world is no longer dictated entirely by the emotional fluctuations of others. This kind of peace feels unfamiliar at first because it does not rely on external conditions being perfect. It does not disappear the moment someone is upset, disappointed, or emotionally unstable around you.
It does not collapse when you are not actively fixing something. Instead, it remains present even in uncertainty. And for someone who has lived primarily in emotional responsiveness, this stability can feel almost strange in the beginning, as if something important is missing, when in reality, something essential is finally returning. What you begin to discover is that your sensitivity itself is not the problem. It never was. The issue was never feeling too much. The issue was what you believed you had to do with what you felt. Sensitivity becomes overwhelming only when it is paired with the belief that you are responsible for managing every emotional experience you perceive. Once that belief begins to loosen, your sensitivity stops feeling like a burden and starts returning to its original form, which is awareness, perception, and depth of understanding. Over time, you begin to notice a shift in how you relate to others.
You are still caring, still present, still emotionally aware, but you are no longer abandoning yourself in the process. You are no longer disappearing inside other people's emotional worlds. Instead, you are able to stay connected while still remaining rooted in your own inner life. This creates a different quality of presence, one that is calmer, more stable, and more genuinely supportive because it is no longer driven by anxiety or emotional depletion. Eventually, there is a quiet realization that emerges almost naturally. You begin to see that the most emotionally intelligent way to live is not to feel less, but to include yourself in what you feel. For so long, your attention may have been directed outward almost automatically, scanning others, responding to others, adjusting for others. But now something changes. You begin to turn that same level of attention inward as well. You begin to ask yourself the same questions you have always asked for everyone else.
You begin to listen to your own emotional responses with the same seriousness you have always offered outwardly. And in that shift, something stabilizing happens. You stop living as if your emotional life is secondary. You stop treating your own inner world as something that can always wait. You start recognizing that your presence in your own life matters just as much as your presence in others' lives. That recognition is not selfish. It is not withdrawal. It is integration. It is the beginning of emotional balance that allows both connection and self-respect to exist at the same time. And from that point forward, everything begins to change in a quieter, more sustainable way. And so what this all comes down to is surprisingly simple, even if it takes a long time to truly understand. You were never meant to disappear inside other people's emotions. You were never meant to lose yourself just to keep everyone else steady.
Reassuring, your sensitivity was never the problem. Your depth was never the burden. The real challenge was learning where you end and where others begin without closing your heart in the process. Because real emotional strength is not about feeling less. It is about feeling fully while still remaining connected to yourself. It is about being present with others without abandoning your own inner world. It is about caring without carrying everything, and loving without losing your own center in the process. And when you begin to live from that place, something quietly powerful changes. You are still the same sensitive, aware, deeply feeling person you have always been. But now, you are no longer leaving yourself behind to be that person. You are included in your own care. You are part of your own attention. You are no longer only a support system for others, but also a place of stability for yourself. That is where real peace begins.
Not in escaping life, not in shutting down your emotions, but in finally standing inside your own experience without guilt, without apology, and without disappearing.